think Yiddish. Seated beside Halpern was his daughter, Jane, who was second chair. She was tall and slender, but with her father's black hair and beaked nose. Jules Halpern certainly had a strong voice for such a slight and small fellow. My client, Geoffrey Schaefer, is a loving husband. He's also a very good father, and happened to be attending a birthday party for two of his children half an hour before the murder of Detective Patricia Hampton. Colonel Schaefer, as you will hear, is a valued and decorated member of the British intelligence community. He is a former soldier with a fine record. Colonel Schaefer was clearly set up for this murder charge because the Washington police needed this terrible crime to be solved. This I will prove to you, and you will have no doubt of it. Mr. Schaefer was framed because a particular homicide detective was going through some bad personal times and lost control of the situation. Finally, and this is the most essential thing for you to remember, Colonel Schaefer wants to be here. He isn't here because he has to be. He has diplomatic immunity. Geoffrey Schaefer is here to clear his good name. Schaefer nearly stood up in the courtroom and cheered.
And so I found myself a player in a truly bizarre game that was habit-forming for all the wrong reasons. I began to make up my own rules. I brought in new players. I was in this game to win. Chuck Hofstadler from the FBI offices in D.C. continued to be helpful. The more I talked to him, the more I realized that he had had a serious crush on Detective Hampton. His loss, and mine with Christine, united us. I climbed up to the attic late Friday night after watching The Mask of Zorro with Damon, Janny, Nana, and Rosie the cat. I had a few more facts to check before going to bed. I booted up the computer, logged on, and heard the familiar message, "You have mail." Ever since that night in Bermuda, those words had given me a terrible fright, a chill that tightened my body from head to toe. Sandy Greenberg from Interpol was replying to one of my emails. She and I had worked together on the Mr. Smith case and had become friends. I asked her to check on several things for me. "Call me any time tonight, Alex, and I mean any time. Your irritating doggedness may have paid off. It's vitally important that you call. Sandy." I called Sandy in Europe, and she picked up after the second ring. "Alex, I think we found one of them. It was your bloody idea that worked. Schaefer was playing a game with at least one of his old cronies from MI6. You were spot on." "Are you sure it's one of the game players?" I asked her. "Pretty sure," she shot back. "I'm sitting here staring at a copy of Durer's Four Horsemen on my Mac. As you know, the Horsemen are conqueror, famine, war, and death. What a creepy bunch. Anyway, I did what you asked. I talked to some contacts from MI6, who found out that Schaefer and this one chap regularly keep in touch on the computer. I have all your notes, too, and they're very good. I can't believe how much you figured out from back there in the colonies. You're a very sick puppy, too." "Thanks," I said. I let Sandy ramble on for a few minutes. A while back I'd recognized that she was a lonely person, and that even though she sometimes put up a cantankerous front, she craved company. "The name this chap uses in the game is Conqueror. Conqueror lives in Dorking, Surrey, in England. His name is Oliver Highsmith, and he's retired from MI6. Alex, he was running several agents in Asia at the same time Schaefer was there. Schaefer worked under him. It's 8 in the morning over here. Why don't you call that bastard? Or send him an email. I have an address for him, Alex." I started to wonder about the other players in the Four Horsemen game. Were there really 4 of them, or was that just the name of the game? Who were these players? How was this game actually played? Did all, or indeed any of them, act out their fantasies in real life? My message to Conqueror was simple and straightforward, and not too threatening, I hoped. I didn't see how he could resist answering me. "Dear Mr. Highsmith, I am a homicide detective in Washington, D.C., looking for information about Colonel Geoffrey Schaefer, pertaining to the Four Horsemen. I understand that Schaefer worked for you in Asia. Time is of the essence. I need your help. Please contact Detective Alex Cross." I was surprised when the message came right back. Oliver Highsmith, Conqueror, must have been online when my email went through.
Detective Cross, I am well aware of you, since the ongoing murder trial is a rather big story in England, and in the rest of Europe, for that matter. I have known G.S. for a dozen years or more. He did work under me briefly. He is more an acquaintance than a close friend, so I have no expertise or bias about his guilt or innocence. I hope it's the latter, of course. Now, as to your question about the Four Horsemen, the game, and it is a fantasy game, Detective, is highly unusual in that all of the players assume the role of game master. That is to say, each of us controls his own fate, his own story. G.S.'s story is even more daring and unusual. His character, the rider on the pale horse, Death, is deeply flawed. One might even say evil. The character is somewhat like the person on trial in Washington, or so it seems to me. However, I must make a few important points. The appearance of any murder fantasies in our game always occurred days after reports of murders in the newspapers. Believe me, this was thoroughly checked by us once G.S. was accused. It was even brought to the attention of Inspector Jones at the Security Service in London. So I'm surprised you weren't informed before now. The service have been to see me about G.S., and were completely satisfied, I assume, since they haven't been back. Also, the other players, who have themselves been checked out by security, are all represented by positive characters in the game. And as I've said, as powerfully involving as Horseman is, it is nevertheless only a game. By the way, did you know that by some scholarly accounts there is a fifth Horseman? Might that be you, Dr. Cross? FYI, the contact at the service is Mr. Andrew Jones. I trust he will vouch for the veracity of my statement. If you wish to converse further, do so at your own risk. I am 67 years of age, retired from intelligence, as I like to put it, and a rather famous windbag. I wish you much luck in your search for truth and justice. I miss the chase myself. Conqueror.
I read the message, then reread it. Much luck in your search. Was that as loaded a line as it sounded? And was I now a player? The fifth Horseman? I went to court every day the following week, and like so many other people, I got hooked on the trial. Jules Halpern was the most impressive orator I had ever watched in a courtroom. But Catherine Fitzgibbon was effective as well. The verdict would depend upon whom the jury believed more. It was all theater. A game. I remember that as a kid I used to regularly watch a courtroom drama with Nana called The Defenders. Every show began with a deep-voiced narrator saying something to the effect of, "The American justice system is far from perfect, but it is still the very best justice system in the world." That may be true, but as I sat in the courtroom in Washington, I couldn't help thinking that the murder trial, the judge, the jury, the lawyers, and all the rules were just another elaborate game, and that Jeffrey Schaefer was already planning his next foray, savoring every move that the prosecution made against him. He was still in control of the game board. He was the game master. He knew it, and so did I. I watched Jules Halpern conduct smooth examinations that were designed to give the impression that his monstrous psychopathic client was as innocent as a newborn baby. Actually, it was easy to drift off during the lengthy cross-examinations. I never really missed anything, though, since all the important points were repeated over and over, ad nauseum. Alex Cross. I heard my name mentioned, and refocused my attention on Jules Halpern. He produced a blown-up photograph that had appeared in the Post on the day after the murder. The photo had been taken by another tenant at the Farragut and sold to the newspaper. Halpern leaned in close to the witness on the stand, a man named Carmine Lopez, a night doorman at the apartment building where Patsy Hampton had been murdered. "Mr. Lopez, I show you Defendant's Exhibit J, a photograph of my client and Detective Alex Cross. It was taken in the 10th floor hallway soon after the discovery of Detective Hampton's body." The blow-up was large enough for me to see most of the detail from where I was sitting in the 4th row. The photo had always been a shocker to me. In it, Schaefer looked as if he had just stepped out of the pages of GQ. In comparison, my clothes were tattered and dirty. I had just come off my crazy marathon run from the zoo, and I had been down in the garage with poor Patsy's body. My fists were clenched tightly, and I seemed to be roaring out in anger at Schaefer. Pictures do lie, we know that. The photograph was highly inflammatory, and I felt it could instill prejudice in the minds of the jurors. "Is this a fair representation of how the two men looked at 10:30 that evening?" Halpern asked the doorman. "Yes, sir. It's very fair. That's how I remember it." Jules Halpern nodded, as if he were receiving vital information for the first time. "Would you now describe, in your own words, what Detective Cross looked like at that time?" he asked. The doorman hesitated, then seemed slightly confused by the question. I wasn't. I knew where Halpern was going. "Was he dirty?" Halpern jumped in and asked the simplest possible question. Dirty? Sure. He was a mess." "And was he sweaty?" the defense lawyer asked. "Sweaty? Yeah. We all were. From being down in the garage, I guess. It was a real hot night." "Nose running?" "Yes, sir." "Were Detective Cross's clothes ripped, Mr. Lopez?" "Yes, they were. Ripped and dirty." Jules Halpern looked at the jury first, then at his witness. "Were Detective Cross's clothes blood-stained?" "Yes, they sure were. That's what I noticed first, the blood." "Was the blood anywhere else, Mr. Lopez?" "On his hands. You couldn't miss it. I sure didn't." "And Mr. Schaefer? How did Mr. Schaefer look?" "He was clean, not mussed at all. He seemed pretty calm and collected." "Did you see any blood on Mr. Schaefer?" "No, sir, no blood." Halpern nodded, then faced the jury. "Mr. Lopez, which one of the two men looked more like someone who might have just committed a murder?" "Detective Cross," the doorman said without hesitation. "Objection," the district attorney screamed, but not before the damage was done. I had been talking with Sandy Greenberg nearly every night. She was helping me collect information on the other game players. She had even gone and talked with the Conqueror. She said she doubted that Oliver Highsmith was a killer. He was late 60s, seriously overweight, and wheelchair-bound. Sandy called the house at 7 that night. She's a good friend. Obviously, she was burning the midnight oil for me. I took the call in the sanctuary of my attic office. "Andrew Jones of the Security Service will see you," she announced in her usual perky and aggressive manner. "Isn't that great news? I tell you it is. Actually, he's eager to meet with you, Alex. He didn't say it to me directly, but I don't think he's too keen on Colonel Schaefer. Wouldn't say why. Even more fortuitous, he's in Washington. He's the top man. He matters in the intelligence arena. He's very good, Alex. A straight shooter." I thanked Sandy, and then immediately called Jones at his hotel. He answered the call in his room. "Yes, hello, Andrew Jones. Who is this, please?" "It's Detective Alex Cross of the Washington Police. I just got off the line with Sandy Greenberg. How are you?" "Oh, good, very good. Well, hell, not really. I've had better weeks, months. Actually, I stayed here in my room hoping you'd call. Would you like to meet, Alex? Is there some place where we wouldn't stand out too much?" I suggested a bar on M Street in half an hour, and I arrived there a minute or two early. I recognized Jones from his description on the phone. Broad, beefy, red-faced. Just your average ex-rugby type, though I never bloody played. Don't even watch the drivel. Oh, yes, flaming red hair and matching mustache. That should help you, no? It did. We sat in a dark booth in back and got to know each other. For the next 45 minutes, Jones filled me in on several important things, not the least of which was politics and decorum within the English intelligence and police communities. Lucy Schaefer's father's good name and standing in the army, and the concern for his reputation, and the desire of the government to avoid an even dicier scandal than the current mess. Alex, if it was true that one of our agents committed cold-blooded murders while posted abroad, and that British intelligence knew nothing about it, the scandal would be a true horror and a major embarrassment. But if MI6 knew anything about what Colonel Schaefer is suspected of doing, well, it's absolutely unthinkable. Did it? I asked him. Is this situation unthinkable? I won't answer that, Alex. You know I can't. But I am prepared to help you if I possibly can. Why? I asked. Why now? We needed your help on this before the trial began. Fair question, good question. We're prepared to help because you now have information that could cause us a hell of a lot of trouble. You're privy to the unthinkable. I said nothing. I thought I knew what he was alluding to, though. You've discovered a fantasy game called the Four Horsemen. There are 4 players, including Schaefer. We know you've already contacted Oliver Highsmith. What you probably don't know yet, but will find out eventually, is that all the players are former or current agents. That is to say, Jeffrey Schaefer might be just the beginning of our problems. All 4 of them are murderers, I asked. Andrew Jones didn't answer. He didn't have to. We think that the game originated in